Probably Dickens' favorite, the pretty city of Rochester held a special place in the novelist's imagery. He described it and referred to it often in the Pickwick Papers, David Copperfield, and Great Expectations. But the city appears elsewhere in his work under pseudonyms. Rochester becomes Cloisterham, Mudfog, Dulborough, or Winglebury. In Rochester, the Royal Victoria and Bull pub was one of numerous pubs that Dickens visited often in search of interesting characters.
This pub here started in the medieval times, Middle Ages, but reached its importance in the late Georgian period, climaxing basically where it gets its name from, the Victorian Bull. It took its name from Victoria because she stayed here one night. The reason she stayed here is because it was a coaching inn. It was a coaching inn because it took Royal Mail coaches coming from London to Dover, and they stayed, watered, changed horses overnight here, as opposed to other pubs. In this street, which is a very long street, it stretches from here to Chatham. And at the time, I think, oh God, there could have been 100 pubs in this one street, catering to different clientele. You can walk towards a hostelry and have a meal, a drink, and it's always there. So Dickens, he used to leave his home in Gad's Hill, travel overland walking, and visit various pubs on the way. As you do, you walk from your home until lunchtime and stop maybe at the Three Crouches, which was a pub very near Gad's Hill, but a good walk, an enjoyable walk, and have a drink. Then he would stagger into Cobham, which was maybe a mile's walk, to the Leather Bottle, where he would stay for a further 3 or 4 weeks writing books and drinking, and then walk back. No wonder his wife divorced him, actually, because she probably, a walk to the pub then may have taken 6 or 7 weeks. I think Dickens came from a lifestyle where his father was a bankrupt, and he had to work very, very hard. When he saw his house, his future house at Gad's Hill, it was a dream. He wished one day to own this beautiful house, and he said, one day I will own this property. It was just a wish. I don't think he ever realized he would actually achieve that dream, like most of us, but he did.
A few kilometers from Rochester, a villa, Gad's Hill, held a special place in the author's memory. When I was a child, we would often walk, my father and I, from Chatham to here, and I was simply fascinated by this villa that represented wealth, elegance, and success. In short, it was everything my family did not have. In The Uncommercial Traveler, I wrote word for word what my father told me one day when we had come to Gad's Hill. "Charles, if you persevere and you work well and very hard, you can perhaps live here one day." 40 years later, Dickens finally realized his childhood dream. In 1857, he became the owner of Gad's Hill Place, this same house that symbolized success in the eyes of his father. The small coastal town of Broadstairs became the vacation spot for the Dickens family. From 1839 on, they spent each summer vacation at this resort. Faithful to custom, Dickens spent his evenings in a local pub. The Tartar Frigate was the most comfortable little sailor's bar along the coast. After my long walks, I enjoyed sitting and listening to the stories of Broadstairs fishermen, and I wrote about them in a piece called Our English Watering Place. It amused me to immortalize them. Oh yes, one can say that I love Broadstairs, and several of its citizens can be found in my work. Broadstairs remains a small resort town today. Every summer, tourists are drawn here by the beaches and its Charles Dickens Festival. During the festivities, Broadstairs once again lives in a Victorian mode, to the delight of the holiday crowd. Events and historical places recalling Dickens' life and sources of inspiration are everywhere. If the Tartar Frigate was Dickens' favorite pub in Broadstairs, by far his favorite residence was this solid house with its crenellated roof. Dickens spent 8 years at Fort House, and after his death, it was renamed Bleak House, the title of one of his novels. It's here, with his writing desk installed in front of a big window facing the sea, that Charles Dickens wrote his most personal and his most famous book, David Copperfield.
So he took his initials, CD, Charles Dickens, and he reversed them to DC, David Copperfield. Do you understand, children? Yeah. CD, Charles Dickens, DC, David Copperfield. And upstairs, you are going to see the very small room where he wrote and formed these famous books. He called it his airy nest. It's magical. In the Victorian days, Britain became millionaires. Britain owed more money than any other country because the rich used the poor. And this is why Dickens is so famous, because he wrote about these conditions. You open any page of any book, it's about the privileged and the underprivileged, the rich and the poor. Now, as you go round, you'll find this is a Victorian house.
The Dickens Museum in Broadstairs is another dwelling that held a special place in the writer's work. This house formerly belonged to Miss Mary Pearson Strong, who was the model for Betsy Trotwood, David Copperfield's aunt.
He certainly knew her for many years because he came for 14 years. And his son describes how they used to come and have tea with this lady in this house. Miss Strong gave him the idea of the donkeys being driven away because he used to watch her get very cross when donkeys were driven in front of this house. And he used this incident in his novel, David Copperfield.
The invention of the steam engine by George Stephenson at the beginning of the 19th century had already led to the construction of several thousand kilometers of railway tracks. But the second half of the century saw an even greater expansion of Britain's rail network. I traveled a lot for my work as a journalist, actor, and lecturer. Each time I was amazed to watch the countryside race by at unimagined speeds. For a man used to a trotting horse, traveling at 50 miles an hour was simply phenomenal. Returning from Boulogne, awaiting the train's imminent arrival in the station with Ellen Ternan and her mother, Dickens had no idea that a few minutes later he would miraculously escape death. The fast train from Staplehurst derailed above a viaduct, and 7 first-class cars plunged into the ravine. One car remained hanging over the void, the one containing Dickens and his companions. Ellen began screaming, and her mother shouted, "Good God! Ladies, ladies, there is nothing we can do," I told them. "You must remain calm and collected. Please, don't scream, I beg you." Witnesses say that after successfully helping his companions out of their dangerous situation, the famous novelist, with his customary cool, returned to the train car to find his flask of eau-de-vie and his top hat. Holding the flask with one hand and his top hat filled with water in the other, Dickens hurried to bring aid to the wounded and the dying. Dickens' heroic behavior showed an inner compassion that manifested itself in philanthropic activity his whole life. Associated with Miss Angela Burdett Coutts, heiress to a large banking fortune, Dickens first built a home for single mothers. Later, the same two philanthropists constructed the first low-rent housing units in London for working-class families who were displaced by the huge train station construction sites. this rail revolution led to the urbanization of England. If the country was 80% rural at the beginning of the 19th century, by the end of Victoria's reign, it was almost the reverse, and Britain became the first country in human history to be mainly urban. Ending the isolation of certain regions, the railway contributed to unifying the country and helped standardize a British lifestyle and culture. Thanks to the appearance of second and third class tariffs, travel was no longer the exclusive domain of the rich. Working class families took advantage of Sunday day trips to escape the pollution of the cities and visit surrounding countryside and the sea. The train in the Victorian era marks the birth of popular tourism.